Hello, this is Professor Nassar. Thank you very much for joining me today as we cover the gross anatomy of the kidney. This is a four-part video series, and this is part 3. If you haven't looked at parts 1 and 2, I would recommend you do those first, as I've covered some of the basic anatomical features there, and it will help you with understanding the parts that we're going to go through here, and also give you a little bit more context. This portion of the kidney that we're looking at is just one lobe of the kidney. Recall that the kidney consists of about 8 lobes that are connected together and sort of smoothed out by this outer capsule. In this model, we're looking at just one lobe of the kidney. This is sometimes colloquially known as the pizza slice model. So let's go through the parts. Capsule, cortex, medulla. Within the medulla, we have the medulla. Each lobe is separated by a part of the cortex that would come down here between one lobe and the adjacent one, and this part of the cortex would be called the renal column. There would be another renal column on this side. This is the renal pyramid, and the tip of the pyramid is called the renal papilla. Let's go through the blood vessels next. Interlobar artery and vein, arcuate artery and vein. We have 2 cortical radiate arteries. From the cortical radiate arteries give off the afferent arterioles. So all the main branches you see coming off the cortical radiate arteries here are afferent arterioles, and on this branch we see more afferent arterioles here. We will zoom in a moment to look at the vasculature and the parts of the nephron in a little bit, but let me just go through the major structures first. From the afferent arteriole continues as a small capillary bed called the glomerulus, a little capillary tuft that gets surrounded by part of the nephron. There's one glomerulus shown here and another glomerulus shown here. The glomerulus then exits this capsule as the efferent arteriole, and the efferent arterioles are shown in this model. Here is an afferent arteriole turning into the glomerulus hidden here. The glomerulus is hidden here by the capsule. And here is an efferent arteriole exiting. You can see one here, one here, one here. On this side, you can see them here. On this side, you can see them here. Efferent, efferent, efferent. And on this side, you can see them here. These are all efferent arterioles. Now, the efferent arterioles then have 2 choices as to where they go. Some efferent arterioles will form a capillary bed up here in the cortex, and this capillary bed will basically surround a lot of these renal tubules. And so these capillary beds are sometimes known as peritubular capillaries. And so they show a little bit of one here. The other option for the efferent arterioles is that they can not stay in the cortex, but instead descend down into the medulla as these long straight blood vessels that are called the vasa recta. We see the artery portion of it here, and then it forms a capillary bed with the venous portion that brings the blood back up. And again, as we talked about in the last video, the vasa recta form an important part not just for bringing oxygen and nutrients to the surrounding medullary tissue, but also play a role in forming concentrated urine. The nephron itself consists of 2 parts. Recall the first part is the renal corpuscle that consists of the glomerulus and the surrounding capsule, called the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule, shown here in white. So the glomerulus and the capsule form the renal corpuscle. Then we have all the different parts of the renal tubule. The renal tubule forms the second part of the nephron. So let's go through the parts of the tubule. This windy part here that forms just after the corpuscle is called the proximal convoluted tubule. It has a sort of a convoluted portion and then a straight portion that goes down here. This part is called the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle, and it has a descending part that goes down this way, then it makes a hairpin turn in the medulla, and then an ascending part that leaves the medulla and goes back into the cortex. The ascending portion then turns into the distal convoluted tubule, which we can see here, another windy part. Then there's a small connector between the distal convoluted tubule here and the collecting duct here. And this little connector is called the connecting tubule. Just this tiny portion here. You can see another connecting tubule here. Here, all of these are connecting tubules from other nephrons. The connecting tubules of the nephrons all join into one large collecting duct. This collects the filtrate from multiple nephrons and carries it down through the medullary pyramid, and then finally until it reaches the bottom here, where it gets renamed as the papillary duct. Recall that the filtrate in here is, or the collecting duct is impermeable to water unless ADH is present. Okay, next what I want to do is raise this up a little bit so that we can see the portions of the nephron in a little more detail. So if you'll just bear with me while I adjust the focus here. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right, again, we have arcuate arteries, cortical radiate artery, afferent arteriole, glomerulus, efferent arterioles, peritubular capillaries, and then this is another efferent arteriole that would be going down into the medulla as the vasa recta. The glomerulus is surrounded by a glomerular capsule, otherwise known as the Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, then there's a straight part, and then a descending part of the loop, ascending portion of the loop of Henle, and then distal convoluted tubule, the connecting tubule, and the collecting duct. And the same thing over here. Proximal convoluted tubule, then we have the nephron loop, the descending and the ascending, then the distal convoluted tubule, connecting tubule, and collecting duct, which will turn into the papillary duct. One thing I want to point out here is, if you notice the ascending limb as it comes up on both of these models, as it comes up here and as it comes up here, it actually, how this model is shown quite deliberately and correctly, is that the ascending limb, as it comes up here, it passes, if you notice, it passes right by the glomerulus. And it does so deliberately. It passes right by the glomerulus and sort of nestles itself into the space between where the afferent arteriole goes in and where the efferent arteriole, shown here, goes out. This part of the ascending limb, basically the end of the ascending limb before it turns into the distal convoluted tubule, is called the macula densa. And we'll talk more about it on the next model. So the macula densa is pretty much the part where the end part of the ascending limb before it turns into the distal convoluted tubule, and it's nestled here between where the ascending arteriole goes in and the efferent arteriole exits the capsule. Same thing here. This is your ascending limb, and if you notice again, it goes right in between where the afferent arteriole enters and the efferent arteriole exits. This part here is called the macula densa, and after this, the ascending limb turns into the distal convoluted tubule. One other feature I wanted to point out, I'm going to lower the model. On your handout, when they are talking about the nephron loop. It says in your handout, note your instructor may ask you to distinguish between the thick and thin portions of this loop. If you notice in this nephron loop, part of the loop looks very, very thin and wiry, and another part looks a little thicker. And these two parts are distinct functionally, and so we ask you to be able to distinguish them in these models. So the portions of the nephron loop are as follows. Again, we have the proximal convoluted tubule. There's a convoluted part of the proximal tubule and basically a straight part of the convoluted tubule of the proximal tubule that essentially forms part of the nephron loop. There's a thin portion of it here. You can see it goes from thick to thin. Functionally, this is not so important as what's happening on the other side. But in any case, they show it for you in this model, so they can, in theory, ask about it on an exam. So here is a thick portion and a thin portion. The thin portion makes the hairpin loop and then goes back up this side. And this is essentially what we can see here is essentially a thin portion that gets a little bit thicker. But on these shorter nephrons, we can't really make much of a distinction between that. Let's look at this other nephron here that goes deeper down into the medulla. Here again is the straight portion of the proximal tubule, and then it gets thin again and makes this hairpin loop. The ascending limb is where really we find a nice distinction between a thin and a thick portion of the nephron loop of the loop of Henle. This portion is called the thin ascending. This portion is called the thick ascending. Thin ascending, thick ascending. We only see the thin ascending in nephrons with long loops of Henle. The thick ascending continues on this way. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. I apologize. Wow, this is why I need a guide. I apologize, I'm on the wrong side of the limb. I feel very foolish now. Well, that's what happens when you do a live recording. So I apologize. This is your proximal convoluted tubule here, your straight portion. You can see there's a long, thin portion here. And then this is the portion, again, where functionally we divide this into two regions. There's a thin ascending and a thick ascending. Thin ascending, thick ascending. And then the thick ascending continues up and then turns into the short section here, which is the macula densa, before turning into the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, I'm sure some of you are shouting at the screen, Professor Nassar, you're naming the wrong tube. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll make a note of it in the comments. All right, thank you. That's it for this lecture on the model of the kidney. We have one more to go.